Welcome to this, the third in our Children's Policy Centre webinar series, in conversation with Children's Commissioners. I'm Sharon Bessell. I'm Professor of Public Policy here at the Crawford School at the Australian National University, and I'm Director of the Children's Policy Centre. You may have seen in the advertisements that my colleague Angie Bexley was going to be facilitating this conversation, but Angie has been unable to join today. So I'm in the fortunate position of being able to step in to talk with Colin Pettit today. I'm in the south of Canberra on Ngunnawal land. This land has never been ceded, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to all First Nations peoples who might be joining us for this webinar today. The Children's Policy Centre is based at the ANU, and we have three objectives. First, to undertake innovative and interdisciplinary research on a range of issues relating to children's policy, and particularly to undertake research with children to better understand their priorities, perspectives and experiences. Second, we aim to connect researchers, policymakers and practitioners working on a range of issues to promote the human rights, wellbeing and best interests of children. And third, we aim to communicate research findings to contribute to better outcomes for children and young people. Today, we are delighted to be joined by the Commissioner for Children and Young People in Western Australia, Dr Colin Pettit. And we're going to be talking in particular about some of the very important work that Colin and his team have been doing around wellbeing, and particularly the findings of the Speaking Out survey that sought the views of young people from Year 4 to Year 12 on a range of factors that influence their wellbeing. From that survey and from other work, Colin and his team recently published a report exploring the decline of wellbeing for girls in Australia. And we'll put the link to that report in our chat if people would like to follow up. And I really do encourage you to have a look at that report. It is very interesting and quite confronting, but an incredibly important piece of work. Colin has been the Commissioner in Western Australia since 2015. He has spent his career working to improve the wellbeing of children and young people. He has been a teacher and a principal in schools across Western Australia and has held senior positions in the Western Australian and Tasmanian Departments of Education. Colin was Secretary of Education in Tasmania prior to taking up his role as Commissioner. Colin is an ambassador for Barking Gecko and for the Valuing Children initiative. He is the Vice-Chancellor of the Children's University Western Australia Partnership, and in February 2019, he was awarded an Honorary Doctorate of Education from Edith Cowan University. Colin, it is such a delight to have you with us. Welcome.
Thanks so much, Sharon. I really appreciate the invite to be part of this.
So, Colin, there are lots of very important issues that we want to talk through today. But before we start, I have to ask, what is Barking Gecko Theatre?
Barking Gecko Theatre is a theatre that's been in existence in Western Australia for over 30 years. And its main aim is to help mainly impoverished children understand and better connect with the arts. And but it's grown into a magnificent theatre for all children in Western Australia.
It's such a great initiative.
Oh, absolutely.
Colin, such a great name too, I've got to say. Colin, before we start, I wonder if you could just briefly outline the role that you play as Commissioner and what your mandate is in Western Australia.
Thanks, Sharon. Can I first of all start by acknowledging that I'm on Whadjuk Noongar land, and I certainly want to acknowledge all of our elders past and present and extend that welcome or acknowledgement to all First Nations people on this broadcast. But it can also just raise on behalf of Aboriginal children and young people in this state, just the value that they place on their culture and the importance that they now see their role in life as a result of that. Now, I think we shouldn't underestimate that we have to connect with those young people because they are our future. And I do want to make that acknowledgement. In terms of the role here, we're like most other children's commissioners. We are independent officers in a West Australian sense, a statutory office. We have our own legislation, and it's a real privilege to work in an environment that is all about looking after the best interests of children and making sure that we monitor their wellbeing across the state. And in Western Australia, we have about 610,000 young people, which equates to 23% of the total population. And the only difference we have with children and adults, well, the most significant difference is that they don't vote. And so we have to find a way to ensure that their voice is heard. It is not privileged above anything else, but it's certainly put in the mix of what we need to do to make our societies a better society. And if we don't include that quarter of the population, then we have some trouble. So my legislation encourages me to ensure that the voice of children and young people is heard, that we value what they contribute, that we certainly acknowledge and support families being better families. And in that way, we can hopefully develop a better community.
Colin, I should have said to the participants in this webinar that you and I will talk about the range of things that you're doing, but particularly the work that you're doing around wellbeing for probably half an hour or so. And then we'll invite people to ask questions or join the conversation. So if you do have a question that you would like to ask Colin, please do put that in the Q&A, and we'll make sure that we have time at the end for people to join in the conversation. But Colin, I wanted to begin by asking you a little about the work that you've been doing around poverty. And of course, as you know, here at the Children's Policy Centre, we have a very strong focus on how we can address child poverty, on multidimensional poverty and the gender dimensions of poverty. In Western Australia, there are child poverty rates that are up there with the national rate of 1 in 6 children living in income poverty. Can you just talk us through some of the work that you've been doing to address that, and what impacts you're seeing in Western Australia in terms of the way poverty shapes children's lives?
Yes, I think it's the secret that no one wants to actually let out of the box. When you say 1 in 6 of our young people live in poverty, whenever I've had conversations with decision makers and others, they always turn that back to, well, the parents aren't doing the right thing. And that may in fact be partially true, but what we're noticing is that children in poverty don't have recourse to actually get out of poverty unless we as a society make some change to it. So we've been really keen to ask young people how they're feeling around the economic position that they find themselves and their family in. Whether they can do things that we want most children to do. And that information has sort of helped shape where we're going into the future about trying to raise the agenda that child poverty in itself is an important agenda that Australians need to talk about. So one of the things that we're doing next in Poverty Week, which is only 2 weeks away, we're releasing a document that we pinched from the English Children's Commissioner. I'll have to put that on the table. She came up with a fantastic idea of asking notable English people their view on child poverty. And so we've done that with some very notable West Australians who run major corporations, who are West Australians of the Year, and have been in this space for a long, long time. And their story and message is there to actually raise the debate about what's wrong with our society that says it's okay to have children live in poverty, and how we can actually start to address it. Because if we do know that material wealth or lack of is one of the most serious indicators of whether our children and young people will grow to be healthy, wealthy, wise, and be part of a society that we want them to be.
I think that's such important work, Colin, and I love that idea of using the views of those people who are in positions of influence, who have a platform, to be able to start to catalyse some conversations. Because as you say, it's a conversation that we need to have, but that we're remaining silent on, and to think much more about what are those structural drivers of poverty, how we overcome them so the children can reach their potential, can live the lives that they want to lead.
I think it's vital.
And Colin, you're also doing some really interesting work around wellbeing. And I wonder if you can just talk us through how you define wellbeing and the kinds of indicators that you've developed to be able to identify how children and young people are doing in terms of their wellbeing.
My legislation is very clear that required to look after and monitor the wellbeing of all children in our state. It's a really complex process in which to do that. And over the course of the life of this office, we've tried a range of different methods, if you like. And we've partnered with Telethon Kids Institute about 5 years ago and looked at what were the key indicators or domains that we want in terms of wellbeing for children and young people. And the three that we came up with, and not in any order, but they are all linked: safe and supported, healthy and connected, and learning and participation. And all of those three things need to happen. Now, if you are familiar with the Eracy nest, they are very similar to the Eracy nest, but they broke them down into further 6 areas. We felt that the 3 areas were fairly easy to monitor. We then looked at the life cycle of a child as opposed to how community sees them. So in terms of our community, we always see them preschool, we see them in primary school, and then we see them in high school. So we looked at across those 3 age range and looked at all the possible data that was around in not only West Australia, but Australia on those issues. And we worked with Telethon Kids to identify the indicators that would give us the biggest bang for buck, I suppose. So we worked on that for nearly 2 or 3 years and found a whole wealth of data. There is a mountain of data in these spaces. Unfortunately, the data is not always able to talk to each other, and it's often is very specific to historical information rather than is it actually serving an issue. So an example I'll give you is one of the data sets we have is how many children eat vegetables, but only between the ages of 9 and 11, because that was a program that was developed 20 years ago, and we continue to monitor that. As opposed to saying, well, shouldn't we ask all children how many vegetables they eat? So we're looking at, there were great holes. Now, all of that information is online. Most of it is publicly available data, but because of my legislation, I can receive other data and publish it, which I have. So if people are interested, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of data sets. It's an easy drop-down menu, and I'd encourage you to have a look at it. The one thing, Sharon, that we found once we had completed that work, and it took, as I said, 2 years, is that there was nowhere in all the data sets that we could definitively say there was the voice of children and young people on how they saw their life in those areas, whether it be as part of their growing up in preschool and primary school and high school, or whether they felt safe at home or safe in the community, etc. So we set about looking nationally and internationally, and places like New Zealand and Canada have run wellbeing surveys across the board. We thought we could use some of the information which we have, and we then partnered with a whole range of different people. And in 2019, prior to COVID, we did a proof of concept where we actually went to about 5,000 young people. My staff administered it across the state with myself, and so it was all hands on deck, and we went right across the state. It was an opt-out option. First time this sort of thing was done in Western Australia and possibly Australia. And the findings we got back from them were a little bit confronting. And so there were 4 things that we were really confronted by, and we were actually quite concerned by them. And we took that to government to say something needs to be done. The first one, no surprise, mental health is now not only topical within all of our community, but young people were talking about their own mental health, but as importantly, the mental health of their families, of their teachers, and they were really concerned how that was influencing their well-being and the lack of support, particularly younger people had in that space. Second one was safety, and that was safety in the home, safety in the community. And what was starting to show in both of those areas, but the girls were actually, or females, and in this presentation, I'm going to interchange girls and females because of different research elements that we've used. So I do apologise for that. But I'm talking about children under the age of 18, girls and females in particular. And so in both of those areas, we started to notice there was a significant gender difference in both mental health and safety. And girls were faring really quite poorly across a whole range of measures. And so that got us into looking specifically at where girls and female responses were. And it was the third issue that just leapt off the page, that gender wellbeing, particularly for females, is such an unspoken truth that we need to bring it to the fore. And the fourth area, which I won't have time to talk about today, but certainly happy to talk later, is the difference for Aboriginal people to non-Aboriginal people, particularly young people, was predominantly around the difference in materialism. And what we found is where Aboriginal people indicated they had plenty of material wealth, similar to non-Aboriginal people, they were doing as well, if not better. But where they didn't have it, there were certainly major gaps, and it's an area of work that we will certainly be looking at into the future. So those four things jumped out at us, and as a result of that, we're doing work in a whole range of them. But today is around, we really wanted to focus on, did we see just a blimp because girls had a first time to say something, or was this a reality? And so we commissioned some work internally and supported by some universities to ensure that the work had credibility, and had a look at both national and international elements that we could, and put in a report. And as you said, once you read it, it actually starts not only to be quite confronting, it's quite a sad tale in a society that believes equity is on the right track.
Colin, I would love it if you'd come back and perhaps talk to us about those issues that you found around Indigenous and non-Indigenous children at some point, because that is so critically important. But we also wanted to kind of focus today on some of those gender differences. And as you've said, the first issue that came out of that Speaking Out survey was the decline in adolescent emotional wellbeing over a decade or so, for a prolonged period of time, but particularly the declines in girls' emotional wellbeing and mental health. From that survey, from the work that you've done around it, do you have a sense of what the drivers seem to be of the problems that girls are facing in particular?
Yes, well, certainly we're working through what are those drivers, but in terms of what the research has shown to us, there are a whole range of connected issues across our society that we needed to have a look at that are driving these things. And I think while on the surface, I think it does look like our community is really making an effort to bring around change the gender difference. What we're seeing in practice, both at a home level, a school level, and community level, is probably not being replicated. So we are still seeing very strong gender stereotypes, domestic violence, income parity, employment and education difference. All of those things contribute to where the young people are seeing themselves. And then if you overlay that with things like social media, you look at sexual activity, you look at the way young people are treated at home, then it's contributing to where girls today are saying, our world isn't as equal as we thought it was.
Colin, there has been, you picked up on the sort of range of issues that are confronting young women and girls in particular. Are you able to say a little bit more, sort of tease out a little bit more about, those points that you made on equity in Australian society and in everyday life? Can you talk a little bit more about what you heard from girls around what we might just call everyday inequality and everyday sexism? It sounds as though there's a future issue when girls look to what their futures are going to be. That's confronting. But did they also talk, or were you able to find what girls are experiencing every day in their lives as young people?
Yeah, I think for many of the people on this broadcast, what I'll now say is probably not surprising. What is surprising is that we haven't seemed to have done enough about it. And I think that's something that as a society we probably need to, and they're probably the next steps. So in terms of what young people are telling us, in terms of equity, we heard a lot from young people about how they were perceived both within their community and within their home life in particular. And some of the key areas that the report itself identified, and then was supported by our Speaking Out survey, was that or we still currently have a media that sexualizes women in particular. And while it may be less subtle than, or more subtle, I should say, than what it was in days gone by, it is still there. And it is probably more invasive through social media than it is through open media. And what the young people are seeing as they grow, that sexualization of females in particular, the stereotyping of what they should look like, how they should behave, who they should be seeking in terms of relationships, etc., are all contributors to the way young people are seeing, particularly females, are seeing how their life is panning out for them. And so that would be the first one that has popped out at us. The second one is that we're still seeing in families, and girls are reporting, as the report has shown, the families, while on the surface are saying, and I have a daughter, and we would, talk often about, I would say to her, she can do anything she wants. But what girls are saying, that conversation is happening, but then it's not translating into actions. And so what they're saying to us is that if they have a brother, their brothers are given more opportunities to go and do things than they are. And it's down to things like moving around their community. As they get older, their brothers are allowed to wander down to the park by themselves. Girls are saying, quite a large number of girls are saying, Mum or Dad will only take me down. I'm not allowed to go down by myself. So there's as subtle as it is, it's making obvious statements that one group is trusted more than the other, and that's being translated. So there are stereotypical behaviours that we're seeing in our community, and the same thing is happening, as much as I hope it wasn't, is still happening in our schools, where girls are saying that boys are offered to do things that at times they're not. Now, the obvious one is maths and science, and there's been a massive push to try and encourage females to take up maths and science, and we're seeing that happen, and we're actually seeing being as successful, if not more so, than boys. But that's not happening across all opportunities in schools, according to girls. And so it's the subtlety that I think is causing the major problems that we have at the moment, not the other. And then they'll go into their home life as well, and they'll still say things like, well, the boys are asked to do supposedly boy things, and girls are asked to do the cleaning, etc., as part of their chores for the family. And that's something that needs to be debated amongst families. How do you actually delineate who does what chores, if that's what you're going to do, and how does that translate for a young person's perception? Have you actually asked them? And what we're finding is that's not being asked. So that's at one level, being contributing to that. We're also seeing social media is, I suppose, capturing girls and females far more than boys in different ways. So we do notice that in terms of an equity issue, girls are more likely to get onto things like Instagram and chat lines, etc. And most of those have stereotypical behaviours around the type of person that a female should fit in terms of weight, in terms of behaviour and so forth. Whereas boys, while they may still be on social media, aren't into those particular platforms, and so are not influenced in the same way. And so there's a whole range of things that we're finding across the board. The report goes into much more detail than that. But in terms of equity, I think we talk a really good talk in our community. I'm not sure that talk is walked, and how we actually change people's views to actually challenge what we are saying and doing is a really difficult thing. And I've actually tested that with a group of teachers to say, can they record how they treat children for a day? And the response has been quite dramatic in terms of they weren't aware of some of their subtle behaviours. It was only when people asked, can you have a look at it and see? So I think that needs to happen in families, it needs to happen in our communities and decision makers and policy makers, etc. The notion of equity is our biggest problem. And I think if you look at the spill out of what that translates to in terms of poor health outcomes, particularly mental health outcomes for children and for girls, we're seeing a growth in harm that girls are doing more so than boys. We're seeing a growth in girls attempting suicide more so than boys, although boys still commit more suicide than girls, but we're seeing this growth. And it's all from about 2010, as you'll see in the report. Most of the research kind of says there's a trigger around between 2010 and 2012 where that decline starts to accelerate. So all of these things, if you look at social media, kick in about there, don't want to actually blame it totally, but it is part of the problem.
Yeah, and certainly as you're talking about social media, I'm thinking of some of the revelations from the former Facebook employee in the United States. So over the last couple of days, it's been reported, and it becomes quite apparent that there needs to be far more pressure placed on those platforms to be accountable to the community broadly, but particularly to be accountable to ensuring children and young people's well-being rather than doing harm. But Colin, I wanted to pick up on the issue that you raised about girls' ability to be out and about in their communities and to connect with their communities. And that's an area that you look at in detail in the report. It's something that we've done a lot of work on here at the Children's Policy Centre. And I must say, in all of the research that I've done over many years with children and young people, the importance of relationships and connection to community always comes up. And I'm really interested to hear a little bit more about what girls were saying about the impacts of them not being able to move so freely around their communities, and whether there are other things that were also undermining their sense of connection to their communities. Yeah,
certainly the relationship that we know that people feel connected to anything, but particularly their community. It's a great protective activity in terms of lowering the opportunity for mental health problems and other issues. So it does interest us to see how young people see themselves within a community. But certainly the one around safety, transport is one that always girls and females in particular raise within their community. They don't feel safe using public transport. And yet many of the West Australian communities, I'm sure around the rest of Australia, are built on the fact that the communities are not self-contained. And so you actually have to move across and through communities to get to activities that are beneficial to you or actually what you want to do. And what young girls and females are telling us is that public transport is they don't feel safe on it. And it's interesting when you talk to boys about the same thing, they don't have the same issue. So there is something about whether we allow behaviours in public transport that are subtle or overt, that is causing girls to feel that way. That's a very big limiter for any young girl, female, to move around their community. Second one is the family home life itself. What we hear a lot from particularly females is that mums and dads will say to their boys, be safe down at the park. Whereas the girls will get a talk about making sure that they don't talk to strangers, making sure that they don't stop and talk to someone who they only just know, go straight to the park, come straight back, and a whole range of subtle or not so subtle instructions, I suppose, that are different to boys. So immediately there is setting up, I suppose, from the home life, and I understand why parents do it, but they're setting up from the home life a view that girls are less safe in their community than boys. So before they step out of their door, they've already been trained, if you like, to have a suspicion more so than boys about their community. And so that suspicion just grows into other things. So there are a number of those sorts of issues that we see. We also see that females, as they age, particularly in the mid to late teens, are not interested in doing activities outside of their safety zone. So they turn more back into social media type events, online, etc. And in doing that, they're actually doing less in their community, and therefore it's that vicious circle of, we know if you're out active, being engaged in the community, your mental health, your health and wellbeing increases. If you're not, then we're finding that there's a gradual decline in mental health as well. So there are a number of those sorts of issues that need to be looked at across our society. They're mostly attitudinal, and they're mostly about us as a policy group, as us as community members and community reps starting to challenge the norm and start to say to parents and others, how can we support you to make this a better place?
Colin, that point that you made about the messages, the often quite subtle messages that girls receive about safety and the need for them to be very cautious in their communities, I think is so powerful, and it aligns so much with some research that we did a few years ago with children in middle childhood, aged between about 7 and 12. And many of those children, particularly, not only, but particularly living in disadvantaged communities or communities defined as disadvantaged on a range of indicators, a lot of them were really very frightened about going out into their communities. And that wasn't because of experiences that they'd had. It was often because of the messages that they received about stranger danger. And what was interesting was the adults that we spoke to in the communities, and particularly in schools, teachers would say, we don't talk about stranger danger anymore. We talk positively about protective behaviours. But what children were hearing was strangers are dangerous and I can't go into my community because it's a scary, dangerous place. And it sounds as though those same kinds of messages are there for girls in adolescence.
I think you're right. And I don't think it's just in the school. I think it's particularly in the home and in other parts of the community. And so this is a discussion that needs to really be had very strongly across the board about how do we change our rhetoric to not lessen the fact that there are some things in our society that we are unsavory, but equally, how do we make it that young people don't fear that by going out, something's going to happen to them?
And I guess, you know, as you say, there are things that do present genuine threats to young women in particular. And your report highlights some of the real gaps in young people's understanding about consent in intimate relationships. And in your report, you quote some research that was undertaken by La Trobe University that found that across Australia, 1/3, 1 in 3 female students who are sexually active have experienced unwanted sex. That's a very, very confronting figure. What are your thoughts on how we can start to promote both sexual health but also respectful relationships so that we start to shift these dangers for young women?
Oh, look, I think this is something that obviously is very topical because of the Parliament issues, etc. But I think it has just absolutely hit the tip of the iceberg that our community, and this is where girls themselves are telling us that they're struggling around, you know, what is consent and is it enthusiastic consent, as we say, or is it actually implied? Now, it's not just the actual sexual activity, but we're finding that in our survey, more than 50% of young girls and females were receiving unwanted sexting. So it's not just the physical act, it's also the emotional tie, that pressure, I suppose, that young girls in particular are finding themselves. So it is a major issue, and I think it is a debate, again, that we shouldn't shy away from, and I'm really pleased and proud of particularly the females or the women who are taking that cause at a political level. But it now needs to translate into, well, how do we translate that in our schooling systems, in debates with parents, in conversations with what happens in our community groups, whether they be sporting or craft, etc. Not to, again, scaremonger, but actually to have a realisation that young people need to know this information so they can make informed decisions. Because we do know that girls in particular are more likely to be harmed from sexual activity, whether it be physical or morally, than boys. But at the same time, we keep telling them they're the ones that have to keep themselves safe. They're the ones that have to practice safe sex. They're the ones who can't get pregnant. But we're not having that open conversation across our community, including boys, to do something constructive about it. And I think certainly the push that I'm seeing from the federal level is to try and bring that into schools. But schools can only be one part of the answer. We actually need a much stronger debate across the entire community And then schools need to actually lead the way for young people to have open and honest discussion about the young person's body, what their rights are, how they actually behave or could behave in activities, whether it be sexual activity, etc. And these are things that the community have struggled to come to terms with. But we know that a whole range of things are happening for girls and boys at the moment in a sexual way that we haven't had in the past. And we know that the growth in pornography and unwanted pornography being delivered to devices across the board, targeted at young people, in particular young boys, is shaping some of the way they think about sex and the way they think about the treating of females in particular. And so that aggression of sexual behaviour is another mix that we need to actually have a stronger conversation around. It is, what is normal and how do we actually build relationships in a way that we are comfortable before we get into all these other things. And so the young people are saying, particularly girls, are really indicating to us that they are really confused about with their role in relationships because of the sexual demand, I suppose, in both sexual activity, but also the online. And they're confused about how that sits within a normal relationship, whatever that is. And they're confused about how that then makes them, whether they can take charge or not take charge of their own life or future. And so the research points a little bit to it. It doesn't get to the bottom of what we can do it, but I think that we're on the right track in terms of raising the profile, certainly having stronger conversations about consensual sex. But I think there's a whole range of things. There's some really lovely work being done now around menstruation and the influence of that on mental health for girls. I don't think we've fully understood the impact in the way that it needs to be, and we need to educate not only young girls and how they can move through that part of their life, but also move through with confidence that this is a normal process and that you will find change, etc. And I'm not sure, as described to me by one teacher, a one-off lesson in a year is really going to cut it. So we need to actually get braver about the total issue around sexual behaviour, sexual activity and sexual development before we get into the other things.
Colin, I think that point that you make about schools having a critical role, but schools not being the only place where we should have these conversations is so important. It always strikes me that almost every social issue that is too hard for every other part of society to deal with gets pushed towards schools to manage. And that's really asking way too much of one institution. And just a small cross-promotion, next week we have Helen Connolly, your colleague, the Commissioner in South Australia, who's going to come and talk to us about some work that she's been doing around menstruation and how to ensure that girls and young women are able to negotiate or navigate those issues with the confidence you talk about. So just to let people know about that. I want to open up in just a moment for questions. I know we have one or two questions waiting, but I did want to ask you before we go to our audience about violence more broadly. This is another issue that's very topical. We've had a strong policy focus on ending violence against women in Australia for more than a decade now. It's a plan of action. A couple of weeks ago, we saw the National Summit on Safety for Women. Of course, more broadly, the Sustainable Development Goals include a target about eliminating violence against women and girls in both the public and the private spheres. But as your report and other research has shown, violence against girls and women remains a significant issue in Australia, not only in terms of the context of intimate relationships, but very broadly across public and private domains. What are your thoughts on how we start to bring about the attitudinal shifts that we really need if we're going to change these experiences for girls and young women?
I think this is at the cornerstone of the debate we need to have. We've invested as a society into things like domestic violence campaigns. And I think they are absolutely essential and a blight on our society that this actually occurs. But what I don't see in all of these campaigns is having a look at the root cause, or how we shift future generations' attitudinal beliefs to each other that often tend to be resulting in domestic violence as young people age. And so what young girls are saying is, yes, that's part of that fear of the community and fear within their community. In fact, a large number, 3 or 4%, which I still think is a large number, of young girls don't feel safe in their own house at all. And so we've got to start to look at how do we provide safe environments for our young people right across the board. But getting back to your question, there are two issues here. I think we must continue to invest, if not more so, in domestic violence and actually change attitudes across the board about how females in particular, it's not always females, but the vast majority of females in domestic violence are treated. But I think there needs to be as equal an investment into how do we change attitudes across our community, but within schools, within our community for young people, about how they see their world growing up. I think there are great models around the place where we've talked a lot to young people over many years around the importance of their environment. And they are the ones who, if you really look at who's leading the charge to try and change the environment, it's young people who are really raising that hand and saying, we need to have this change. I think they could do the same with this. I don't believe that young men or young boys start to grow up to want to be abusers. And I think we need to capture them before they get to that space about what is acceptable behaviour. How do we treat each other with respect? How do we move forward? And the report indicates there are certainly indicators along the way that boys are not being given an opportunity to develop those skills across a range of things, whether it be social media, sexting, etc. And all of those things contribute downstream to areas like domestic violence and the way we treat women and the lack of equity and so forth. So two areas I think need to happen. One, maintain the level of support and interest in domestic violence and try to address it now and in real time and actually really ramp that up. But secondly, really and sincerely have a look at how do we change behaviours from young people up.
Thanks, Colin. I think they are such important messages that we need to heed and to act on. I wanted to turn to a couple of questions that the audience have put forward. And the first is, did this fantastic piece of work, and it genuinely is a fantastic piece of work, did this fantastic piece of work reveal any gender-specific needs or recommendations for capturing children's voices? Are there approaches that are more or less effective for learning from girls and young women? And obviously with respect to not reinforcing harmful gendered norms.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it's quite simply solved. What we find with any consultation with young people, we're very, very genuine about why we want to ask the questions. We're very genuine about how we're going to use the responses, and we also are genuinely feed back to anyone who we've consulted with about how to move forward. This report was the first step, if you like, as a response from the Speaking Out survey of 2019. And I should have said we've just completed 2021. We had originally planned to do another survey in 22, but because of COVID, we were encouraged by government to come and have a look at what the impact of that was having on health and wellbeing as well. And so that report will be out in about 4 weeks. And the prelim looking at it is that it amplifies many of the things we've talked about and raises a few others. So we really think that these are the issues that need to be looked at. And so in terms of what we're planning to do with this from this point on is we're actually looking at developing what we call reference or advisory groups of young females, through 2 of those and 1 of a female-male group, to look at the issues and say, what are the solutions and how can you help us lead the way forward? We're then looking at a range of forums and seminars with young people, particularly young girls, to look at where the next steps are, how we can actually bring about change. And we found in the past when we've done that, they've got some great ideas and we need to actually start to listen to them. So your question about should we ask, I think is absolute must. And then from that, we're we will then hopefully grab a whole range of young men about the same age group and say, well, this is what young females are telling us. What do you think? How do you think you can change? Is this accurate? How do you see your world? Because while we're talking about females, males will have other issues that we need to address as well. It's not one or the other. And so we need to have a look at how we can encourage that. So in terms of your question, I think you've got to be genuine in what you ask and why you ask it, and be very clear to the young person as to why it needs to happen. I'm always surprised with parents and teachers who come along to our sessions and go, how did you get that from them? And it was basically we asked. And yet these people, their parents and teachers have them for, anything up to 12 hours a day, and have the capacity to try and open that conversation up. And what we're saying, we're hearing from all young people, so long as you're genuine and you really care about what you're putting out, they will tell you, warts and all, how they feel their life is.
Colin, we often have in our research people saying to us, how did you possibly get an 8-year-old to talk about that? And it's exactly the same response. We asked, and then we listened respectfully, and we engaged in a serious conversation. I think, so often young people desperately want to be able to talk through issues, but are just not given the opportunity by adults. There's a comment from James McDougall in the chat. James, I have given you the power to ask the question yourself, I think, if you would like to. Would you like to ask that question?
Sure.
I love giving people the power to speak. Thanks, James.
Sorry, yeah. So I'm really excited by the findings, and also by the conversation that you've been having about the importance of relationship and sexuality education. I'm interested also in how that conversation moves forward, and whether or not the rights language is helpful. A lot of people who are comfortable with child rights will recognise that there's enormous value. You've got rights to safety, you've got the right to freedom from violence, you've got rights to information and education, all of which play out really well for this conversation. And we know that children and young people are absolutely committed to having those conversations, but not so much with adults. And the challenge is how to engage parents, sometimes teachers, and sometimes also, interestingly, people working in the domestic and family violence space are really not prepared to go that step to involve children and young people in the conversation about their rights. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about what's the most effective way forward.
Yeah. Well, another great question. Thanks, James. My legislation actually has within it that I have to ensure that the rights of children are upheld. So it's one of the few bits of legislation I've seen pretty much anywhere in Australia where it's actually written in. And so everything we do is about child rights. And we always talk to children and young people in consultations about their rights and the things that you've just expressed. We're probably doing a number of things. The report has gone far and wide, and including the Prime Minister and others, and we've asked that at some point we have some catch up with he or the Minister responsible for women's interests. But we're also looking at state level. We shared it with our colleagues across the commissioners, and they're using it in a range of ways. So the report shouldn't be a thing that just sits on a table. We also use it in many ways to whenever we respond to public comment in inquiries and so forth. So it does get there. What we're doing or moving forward with, James, is we're actually only talked yesterday about ways that we're going to actually open up our database to policymakers. And so in a way that, and others, researchers and others, so that the voice of children and young people can actually be heard and their rights are actually put into as much research as possible. And we think that in itself will be a major step forward. However, I think it's like everything else. Governments have so many competing interests. We need to find why this is more important than anything else. And I think we need to latch ourselves onto the consent discussion that has been had more broadly. We need to latch onto the domestic violence issues that have had, and actually just keep knocking at the door until people listen. And there, excuse me, there are always going to be people, as you've indicated, that aren't going to think that kids have these rights. I think we have to work around them and through them and just keep pushing, because if we don't, no one else will.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just waiting to see if there are any other questions, Colin. I'm going to slip one more question in myself. And we've talked a lot about young women and the fact that your findings demonstrate so powerfully that girls and young women are not doing as well as young men in terms of their well-being. I wonder whether, either through the Speaking Out survey or through other work that you've been doing, you are able to comment on what's happening for LGBTI young people, and if we see similar worrying gaps in well-being.
Look, we in 2019, for the first time, asked young people to identify as male, female, or other. Normally it was male, excuse me, male or female, and we had a very low percentage of young people indicating that they were other. But what was interesting, when we took their information out separately, what we found was that their responses were almost identical. And I suppose if you looked at the report for girls, their responses were at the lower end of where girls were responding, at the very lower end. So they too have these issues. Now in 2021, we did a much bigger sample size. We had nearly 16,500 young people across our state, aged 8 to 18, respond to our survey. In that space, there were well over 200 young people indicated that they were not male or female. And because of that, while we can't be absolutely definitive, we can't say it's a representative sample, there is enough of a sample size for us to interrogate that more. And we're in the process of writing a fairly brief report that will sit alongside the Speaking Out survey. And we'll be working with other groups then around LGBTI. 3 years ago, I had an advisory group who did work with us. They were from the LGBTI community, and they produced 4 videos, which for us, off their own bat. And 3 of those are now being used by education systems to educate teachers about how young people see themselves. So there are lots of things that we need to do. The LGBTI group do have specific needs, and we are going to address that. It'll be separate to the girls though. But you can probably draw from the girls scenario. If they're at the bottom end of where the girls are, it is not a very pretty sight for those young people who see themselves in that space.
Yeah, I think, Colin, even with a relatively small sample size, that's such important work, because we really know so little about some of those issues relating to well-being and young people who don't identify within a gender binary. So that's a report that we would love you to come back and talk about as well.
Sure.
We will need to draw this conversation to a close. We're almost at the time when people will need to go off to other commitments. But I wonder, this is a almost impossible question to answer, but I'm going to raise it anyway. I'll put it to you anyway. You know, in terms of moving forward, what are the 1 or 2 first steps that we critically need? And I think if we think particularly about our leaders, our politicians, our decision makers, what are the 1 or 2 things that you think we need to see happen immediately to start to shift these things?
Yeah, Sharon, there's so many things we need to do, but I'll get to 1 or 2. Can I just say the first one about the report itself? It is not definitive, and while it's not a positive report, it is a report I think needs attention, and that is where I think we need to start. I think there needs to be a much greater debate about what the role of female and males within our community and how we actually address that. If you think about the last 3 or 4 years where we've had such great input in terms of what we're seeing publicly for women's sport and women's activities, that's not translating into how girls are seeing themselves in our community. And so we need to actually get a little bit smarter than just say, well, look at the sport, we fix that. So that'd be the first thing I think the debate needs to raise. And I think around the consensual activity is certainly the way to raise this debate in a positive way, but it can't just be anchored on that. You look at the report, well, I think the most alarming thing in the report is that overall in the last 10 years, there has been this massive decline for girls across the board. And it's a 10-year, it's a generation of young people who have suddenly lost interest or lost direction. And we've got a problem and we need to address it. I think that, so from that point of view, I think there needs to be some really strong research about what's causing this. We've identified the issue. We've looked at some of the I suppose, high-level things, but what's causing it and what can we do to be different? And they're two things that I think we can do. Governments themselves have to stop doing whole of government programs that assume we're going to fix things. So launching a domestic violence campaign is a really good thing, but it will not solve gender imbalance. And we can't keep hiding behind programs saying we're doing this bit, therefore we're meeting our need. We've actually got to have the debate and say what's the cause for gender imbalance, gender inequity across the board that is causing our young people to almost have despair. And I think that's the bit that the point that I really would love to see politicians have a debate on, about how do we change issues around mental health, how do we change sexual activity, how do we change education, how do we change community environments. All of those things need to work together. And I've gone too far. So I'll stop there, Sharon.
No, I don't think you've gone too far at all, Colin. And I think, you know, that core message that these are conversations that we have to have and these are issues that we have to address is just so important. We can't continue to pretend that things are okay for children and young people when we know they're not. And the work that you are doing is just so important in contributing to those conversations being had. So Colin, it has been such a pleasure to have you with us today. I did want to remind people that the recordings from this webinar are available on our website. The conversations that we had with Bruce Adamson and with Justin Mohammed are now available there. We'll be back next week, as I said earlier, that's on the 14th of October, to talk again about gender issues in childhood and adolescence. And we'll be joined by Helen Connolly, the Commissioner for Children and Young People in South Australia, to discuss her report, Menstruation Matters, and why it's so important to talk about menstruation and what that report reveals about the systemic inequities that need to be addressed to ensure that menstruation does not pose a barrier for young women's well-being. But for now, Colin, thank you so much for joining us today, for sharing your insights and your wisdom. We so often talk about childhood and adolescent well-being, but so often those conversations are gender blind. Your work is such an important contribution, and thank you for doing it. And thank you for joining us today.
Thanks very much, Sharon.
And to everyone else who's joined us, thank you for being here today. And we hope to see you again in our next In Conversation with Commissioners. Thank you, everyone.